Hello guys, I know it's been a while since I posted here, but I'm back with some new content. So what I'll be showing you guys today is how to set up trpc together with tanstack query, together with Remix or react-routerv7. Now I already have a project set up here. What I'll only do in this project, I'll show you how to set it up or how I have set it up. Then I'll show you how you can still reap those benefits just using Remix itself, because all the benefits that we get from, let's say, tanstack query or even trpc, they can all be reaped from Remix itself or react-routerv7. So once I'll be done with this video, I'll actually push this code to GitHub so that all of you can maybe use it as a reference or as a starter for your project. Now before I start, I'd like to mention that I'm using auth, like for my authentication, together with Prisma as my ORM. I only have a simple SQLite database here, and so let me just talk you through how I set up auth first. So what you'd want to do is, inside your app directory, you'd come to your utils, then create a folder called auth. Then inside here you start with the server. So what you'll do here, you create a global auth instance and then define how you want to authenticate your users. So in my case, I chose social providers, and for that case I needed to have my Google client secret and client ID for them to use it for authentication against my application on Google Console. Now what follows next is the adapter that I want to use for my database. So because I'm using Prisma, I'll only provide the adapters Prisma and the provider. Then you can either use a schema that they provide to interface with your database, or run a script that will generate this. I'll leave a reference to their documentation for you to refer to it. But now once you're done with setting up the server instance, what you'll do, you'll come back to the routes folder. Inside here you'll create a resource route called auth. Now auth here, whatever the global auth instance we created from auth, it has an handler that will take in the request and then handle everything that you would want to do with your request. For example, create the link that will redirect them to like the Google login page or sign up page. Then now once that's done, you come back here, then you create the client instance of the auth client. This is what you'll use now on the client side. Now I also created the sign in page and a user page for them to be redirected after authentication. So inside my sign in page, I only use the auth client, and then here I just specify the provider that I had. They have a couple of providers. You have things like GitHub, Apple. In my case I used Google. And then the callback URL is where you want to send them after like successful authentication. Then I only have a button here that once it's called, it only calls this function. Then this function makes a request to the server endpoint that we created here. Then that will handle now the authentication. Let me actually show it to you. So if we could go to sign in, and now once the user is signed in, we only get redirected back here. Now what I have inside this user page is only a loader. This load is actually used to get the user, but now using trpc. I'll show you how that works. Then once I get the user, I just return the user and then access the user using the loader data here. Now let me show you how to set up trpc. So for trpc, what you'll first do, you'll create a server folder. This is how I like to separate it. Server folder, then inside here you'll have the global instance of trpc. It's advised in their docs that you only have one global instance, including context. So inside here, what we'll do, using the init trpc class from trpc server, we'll initialize that global object here, or global instance. Here we only define the transformer. This is used to transform the request to and from the server. Then we also have an error formatter. This is used to format our errors, like give them a good shape. And if you're using something like Zod for validation, that will be used here to have your errors formatted well. Now, once that's done, I have utilities down here. So this t.router, what it does, it helps us to make routers. Routers, let me call them, they're synonymous to what you'd have, let's see, an endpoint in REST. Then now we have the public procedure. Those are the functions that you'd run over on your server from your client to get the information that you need, let's say data. We also have a protected route, which uses a middleware that checks if we have a user inside the context. And if we don't have the user, it only throws a trpc error. But if we have a user, we call the next function. This is much more like what you have in Node.js or Express. Now this next function calls the next middleware or the actual procedure, like function, and then passes in the user object. Now we also have a create caller factory. This allows us to use trpc in the server context, and in the context of Remix or react-routerv7, this is inside our loaders and actions. But now we also have a context. This context is whatever information that we want to pass to all our procedures. And in our procedure can either be a query or a mutation or a subscription. Now, what you only do here, using our global auth instance from BetaAuth, we get the current session. Then using that session, we only set or return the user inside the context. I also return the database context for us to do queries against our database once we send the request to, let's say, our procedure or mutation. Now once that's done, you'd have to come back here inside our API route and then create a trpc resource folder, a resource module. What you'll define here is an action and a loader, and now I've created a function which will be used to handle the request. So what you do, we only use this fetch request handler that we get from trpc adapters fetch. Then we pass it the endpoint that we want all requests to be routed to. We pass it in the request, our router, which we created that inside our server, and then our context. Remember, we created this function here to initialize our context with our user from the auth session and our database instance. And once that's done, you'd come to your routes file, and then you'll define a catch-all route that points to API, trpc, and then matches any other segment that you'll have after this. Now once that's done, now that's set up for the server side. You'd want to have the same on your client, but now this time we want to set it up together with tanstack query. So what you do, you come to your utils folder, come to trpc, then you create a react.tsx file. So what we have here, the first function, whatever it does, it initializes a new query client from tanstack query. Then we have the global query client that we want to use. So we just call it browser query client, which can either be a query client instance or undefined. Then we have a function now to either initialize the query client if the window is undefined, or if we don't have that query client here, we just fetch in a new query client so that we have one global instance of that. And then this function here for the base URL is whatever is used to get the first, or let me call it the location that we need to use to serve our endpoints from. So in my case, because I'm on localhost, this is what I'll do. If at all we're inside the browser, I will just use whatever the browser gives us using the window.location.origin. But over on my server, I'll just use my localhost. In case I had, let's say, my application hosted, then I'd save this inside my env file and then just use process to access it. Now, for the client, what you'll do here, you need to have a global provider or context provider that will give the client both the query client from tanstack query, and the trpc client from trpc react. Now this is what we do. Inside here, we first of all define the links. Links are what transform, or they're what define how your request is manipulated before it gets to a procedure or an endpoint. So this logger link is what is going to be used to log out the requests. And then this HTTP batch link takes all your requests and batches them into one request. Now once that's done, we create the global context here. And you see what we do here, we only get, let me actually type it out. We get the query client from tanstack query. Then we also initialize the trpc client. Now the trpc client, I have to find a file that will be used to create this trpc client. Let me show it to you. So inside trpc, we have a create trpc context from trpc tanstack react query that will create a context that will give us one hook. So we have a use trpc hook and a trpc provider. So this provider is what we're using inside here to provide the trpc client and the query client from tanstack query to our entire application. Something I forgot to mention is that once you have your global trpc object setup or instance, you will need to export the type to the client so that you get end-to-end typing. Now that's why we define it here, for it to take on the types that we have from our backend or from our server. Now once that's all said and done, what you need to do next is define your different endpoints or routers. So in my case, what I did, I just came into the server directory inside the routers and created an example route. Now remember, we also did the global utilities that we'd use. So we have a public procedure and a protected procedure. So what you do here, we export this greeting router, which has one endpoint. That's hello, which only returns hello you. And if you can see here, we're using query. This is more like a GET request. Then we also have a mutation that uses now the protected procedure, which we saw uses a middleware to handle like authentication, authorization. You can have like a lot of things done inside here before you pass on the request. Now, if you remember, inside our context, we had our database and our user. So you can actually access this anywhere inside your procedure or inside your mutations. Let me show it to you. So this context object is passed on to all procedures. See, we still have the database and our user here. Now, once that's done, we create an index file where we define the global router and call it app router. Then we use the utilities that we created to create this trpc router, and then we assign to it the greeting router. Normally you just do it this way. Let's say, for example, you had user, then we do, let's say, t, then you'd go on to create your routers here. But because of, for the concern of just having a cleaner folder structure, I just separate them all to a different routers folder and then use that. Now inside our client, inside my home route, let me actually go there. Now inside my home route, what I only have here is just a screen that utilizes now the trpc client on the client side using the use trpc hook that we get from the tanstack query integration with trpc. Now what you do, you just define your normal use query and then use that client to access whatever endpoints that you defined. And the beauty with this is that you get all the typings correctly. So for example, you do trpc, see we had a greeting router, then we had an hello endpoint, then we can just pass in the query options. Now if I come and inspect on my network tab here, you see that request is made, and this is what we get back. And if I look at my console, ignore the errors. If I look at my console, you see this is whatever we have logged out. Now to handle mutations, you'll just use mutation, and using the same trpc client you can access the mutations that we have on our object. So we had a greeting endpoint or router and a user endpoint, then you pass in the mutation options. Now what I have here is only a button that once I click it, it runs and returns whatever we get from the mutation function that we defined. Now let me show you how that works. If I click on this, you see we get the current user, and this is actually what we defined inside our router. If I go back to my router, my greeting file, you see I just accessed the context and accessed the database, and then used the user instance to fetch the user from the database. And now once that's done, I return the name and ID of the user. And if you come back to my application and fetch that data, this is exactly what we get. So I get the name plus the user ID. Now this setting up all this takes some time, but you can see the immediate benefit that you get is the typings, like the strong type safe API that you have, or layer that you have between your front end and your back end. But then it is not that necessary, because you can actually have the same only using Remix or react-routerv7. Let me show you what I mean. Now whatever I did here inside my routes, I just created a resource route that only has a loader and an action. I think it's only an action. So inside here, using the feature API that we have inside Remix, what I did, I just created a hook to initialize it each time, and then returned an object that contains all the feature options, but then I override, like I did an override inside the submit. Now it is now where the magic happens. Inside my interface, I have defined the type of data, like how the data would look like, that will be sent inside my action. And you see here I have the request object, and then I transform it to JSON and type it as action data. So whenever a post request is met to this endpoint, I just return that object, and here I return the name on the edge. So what we can do here, I'll come back to my home route, like so, comment this out, comment this out, and then uncomment this. So what I've done here, I only have an handle feature submit button that uses the same hook that we defined. So what to do here, it's actually here. So I think I cleared it. Yeah, so after debugging, I'd actually left the initial hello here, so that's why we had the error. But then this is how it works. So inside our feature, which I get from the hook that I created, because I had done an override inside the normal submit, I get all the typings. You see I get age, and it has to be a number. If at all I do a string, you see it won't work. I have to do a number here, and then that works. So if I click fetch data, I get the same data. So you see, you don't actually need all that setup. It's actually a matter of preference if you so choose to use something like trpc or tanstack query, or if you have needs that which Remix or react-routerv7 can't in itself solve. But majority of what you get from all these libraries, you can get from Remix itself. Yeah, I think I'll push this code to GitHub, and then I'll give you access. I'll actually leave it down below this video. I'll see you in the next one.